Sometimes it's difficult to admit, but all of us are more or less helpless before the torrent of events that we call our lives. We make choices, we bow before circumstances, we conform sometimes, we rebel sometimes. We tell ourselves that we have had some choice in our actions in the flood of reality that we have faced. For some of us, those who are socially networked with strong social safety nets, that flood is most of the time merely a tide washing in. But still, even for the most fortunate among us, there are those things that we call circumstances. Why didn't I take that job instead of this job? Why didn't I choose that person instead of that person to be my friend? When that thing happened, why did I do that instead of this other thing? And that's for the lucky people. For others of us, the flood of life circumstances can be overwhelming. Job loss or joblessness, suffering from abuse and trauma, having little to no sense of control and self-determination, minimally surviving. But, what does surviving even mean? As the great blues artist Memphis Minnie sang a long time ago, back in the 1920s, "Crying won't help you, praying won't do you no good. When the levee breaks, mama, you got to move." How we survive the flood and that levee breaking, or how we don't quite survive, those things become the stories of our lives. Each of us has a story, or several, about how we kept going during life's various breakages of the levees, and that, of course, is the story of our lives, the narrative of our lives that tells us and others what we mean by our very existence. And that's what I really want to consider today, how our circumstances create our reality and the way that we think. How much do we control what we think and do? And thanks for joining me on this Independence Day holiday. Today marks the first Sunday in our summer season of programming, and the theme this year is Season of Change, Summer 2020 at FUS. Change. We know there is now and will continue to be a lot of change this summer. Mostly positive change, we hope, but potentially some bad change as well. And I agree with Heraclitus and with the Buddha that change is the only constant in our reality. Change, well, it causes pain, but it also improves the conditions of life for some people. Today I want to think about change in ourselves, each of us, and how that can lead to positive results for the larger and larger communities of which we are a part as we build and build out those circles of compassion. Now, first, here's a story about Rabbi Zoska. Rabbi Zoska of Hanipol, Ukraine. He lived in the 1700s. And there are lots of stories about this rabbi. One story is that he was dying. Rabbi Zoska told his students from his deathbed, "I'm afraid." And the students were amazed. And one of the students finally said, "Rabbi, you have always told us that God is full of love and kindness. Why would you feel afraid?" Zoska said, "I'm not afraid of God. I know that God will not ask me why I was not Moses or Isaiah. I'm afraid that God will ask me why I wasn't Zoska." That pretty well summarizes what I'm trying to get at today, I think. We're living in times of great transition, great change. That can lead to feelings of, how can I do more? Am I inadequate in the face of all of these changing realities? And the answer is that no, you are not inadequate. No one will ask why you aren't Moses or Muhammad or Gandhi. And there's no point in asking yourself that question either. Our question to ourselves is rather, how are my gifts and my limitations most useful to the wider community right now, here, today? Each of us needs to wrestle with that point until we get it. You didn't have much choice in how you got here, really. All any of us can do is attempt to act in a way that contributes to the larger social good, sometimes because and sometimes despite our personal circumstances. In the midst of the vast changes that we've faced in these past several months, I've been considering two related concepts in my talks on Sunday mornings: compassion and liberation. I have argued that I think the Buddha was correct. Our work, our inner spiritual work, is first compassion for the self, then an exercise of ever-widening circles of compassion until we embrace all sentient beings and the earth and the cosmos itself in our circle of care. Keep expanding. And no, that's not an easy task. That's why it's the main goal of one of the world's major religions. Buddhism asks us to do that, and so does Stoicism. In Buddhism, the purpose of compassion is the desire to liberate all sentient beings from suffering. Yes, that liberation can be imagined as some otherworldly nirvana out there, or it can be imagined as a very real liberation right here, right now, in this society, on this earth. This is the clear and explicit goal of humanism. The first Humanist Manifesto of 1933 proposed 15 points that they hoped would define humanism. The 15th and last point is, quote, "We assert that humanism will, A, affirm life rather than deny it, B, seek to elicit the possibilities of life, not flee from them, and C, endeavor to establish the conditions of a satisfactory life for all, not merely for the few. By this positive morale and intention, humanism will be guided, and from this perspective and alignment, the techniques and efforts of humanism will flow," end quote. So, those goals. 1, affirm life rather than deny it. 2, seek to elicit the possibilities of life, not flee from them. And 3, endeavor to establish the conditions of a satisfactory life for all, not merely for the few. I think those are some pretty darn good goals. The humanists of 1933 knew that they had their work cut out for them. I talked about that a few weeks ago. And we today, in the summer of 2020, we know that there is difficult work and deep change that must be done. One key to deep change, both personally and socially, I think, is encapsulated in another of those 15 points of humanism proposed in 1933. It's the 4th point, and it goes like this, quote, "Humanism recognizes that humanity's religious culture and civilization, as clearly depicted by anthropology and history, are the product of a gradual development due to our interaction with our natural environment and with our social heritage. The individual born into a particular culture is largely molded by that culture," end quote. And that is a very important point, I think, and where most of us get stuck in our thinking and in our doing and changing. We have compassion and we desire liberation for all sentient beings, but we're trapped within the walls of the culture that we are born into. And for Americans, that is first and foremost a culture of hyper-capitalism and white supremacy. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned the work of the Jamaican liberation philosopher Sylvia Wynter. Dr. Wynter insists that the first step in liberation is challenging the process of recognizing our own social location, and that we are, as she phrases it, a particular genre of humanity. Interesting way of phrasing it. A particular genre of humanity. As point 4 of the Humanist Manifesto phrases it, quote, "The individual born into a particular culture is largely molded by that culture," end quote. This molding has to do with gender, body type, sexuality, health, physical ability, race, social class, education, employment, age, nationality, and the list goes on and on. Nowadays, we are learning even about epigenetic trauma, how it gets passed down from generation to generations. Oh, there are a whole lot of genres of human beings. Each of us has been molded, but yeah, we've had some decisions in that molding, but we've also been forced into those molds by our social location. Each of us is a genre of human. Realizing that fact and then rebelling against the prejudices forced upon us by that mold is the very work of personal liberation, the first step. And perhaps the most difficult thing of all about that process is that for many of us, we only see others that are molded as we have been, and therefore we begin to think that this is the only way and the best way to be human, the best genre of human. And that thinking destroys the lives of others. I suppose Sylvia Wynter's use of the word genre resonates with me because I am a creative writer. I've spent my adult life exploring genre as the subject and the technique of writing. I love writing just about anything: poetry, fiction, drama, expository writing. And I've written and published in all of those genres and the subgenres within them because I enjoy learning about a genre and then doing that and then breaking the rules of that genre. As the cliche goes, writers, we're only interested in our next book. And so I am finishing my next book in a couple of weeks. I've just got a contract for it. And in that book, I've been consciously manipulating and transgressing, if you will, genre expectations, both to create a book and also to explore character. The title of my next book is The Art of Prophecy, a how-to guide from beyond the grave by Amos, a major minor prophet. I know, it's a long title. I've been doing a sort of pastiche on the how-to genre, for one thing. How do you be a prophet? What's the steps in becoming a prophet? And I'm also using the memoir genre, that also has particular expectations. And of course, mine is a fake memoir. I'm also using biblical exposition. That's a genre because my book contains almost the entire book of Amos from Hebrew scripture, and even though I've chopped it up into little more manageable pieces. And the book is a mixture of poetry and prose. My new book continues a long process of mine, ways I've been working through some ideas. A few years back, I published a translation of the Gospel of Thomas, which by the end of my translation, by golly, Jesus turns out to be a humanist. And in my newest book, it turns out that the Hebrew prophet Amos is a humanist. Go figure, right? Anyway, in my life as a writer, I've enjoyed learning about the expectations and the methods of particular genres. Then I've enjoyed deconstructing genre expectations. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I probably have a dozen books that I will never get back to because they just didn't work out. So Sylvia Wynter's insight that each person is a particular genre of humanity, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it gives me some hope about dismantling oppressions. In the book, I've been exploring a particular genre of person as well, as I mentioned, character. Amos was a shepherd, and shepherds have a good rep in Hebrew and Christian scriptures, but in point of fact, shepherding was and is a low-paid, low-status occupation. Also, Amos was from Tekoa, a poor and isolated village in Israel, the outback. Amos leaves the country and goes to the city to preach against social injustices. Mostly the hoarding of privilege and wealth by the few is what he has to talk about. And he specifically attacks the hypocrisy of the dominant religion, which has come to enforce those forms that keep most people down. Now, Amos's most famous lines are, "Let justice flow down like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Pretty good writing, I think. Amos, though, failed in his mission. He was stoned to death by a mob in the street out in front of the temple. His only success was that someone wrote down his words, and he made it to the minor prophet status. And in case you haven't figured that all out yet, or maybe you don't know me too well, that's the genre of human being that I consider myself. A displaced farmer who went to the city and has railed against injustice. Though I haven't managed to write anything as good as "Let justice flow down like the waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream," I have to admit. Just as the folk singer Woody Guthrie believed that his guitar was the machine that kills fascists, you've seen the pictures of that, I'm convinced that humanism can kill hypocrisy and oppression. If and only if humanists of whatever nation and race realize that Sylvia Wynter speaks the truth, we are all a particular genre of humanity. Poetry is not better than prose. Prose is not better than exposition. Drama is not better than poetry. All genres are valid and true and art and contribute. We are all a genre of humanity, and we must strive to be self-aware and to think outside the strictures of our genre. The First Humanist Manifesto got it right, I think. Quote, "The individual born into a particular culture is largely molded by that culture." End quote. So yes, racism is a social construction. Homophobia is a social construction. Patriarchy is a social construction. Injustice is a social construction. Poverty is a social construction. And yeah, that list can go on and on. All are structures and strictures created by human beings to benefit some and suppress and oppress others. And all of them are wrong. And all of them need to be changed. As Minnie said, crying won't help you, praying won't do you no good. When the levee breaks, mama, you got to move. Once in a while, let's check that list that humanists long ago left for us. 1. Affirm life rather than deny it. 2. Seek to elicit the possibilities of life, not flee from them. And 3. Endeavor to establish the conditions of a satisfactory life for all, not merely for the few. On this Independence Day weekend, let's resolve to help a few more of our fellow human beings to breathe free in the coming year. Thanks for listening. You can find much more about humanism and what's happening at First Unitarian Society in Minneapolis by visiting our website at firstunitarian.org.